Hey, Fromaholics, it's Julie B. Deep Dives, and this is part one of a special deep dive series into my theories on the man in yellow and the boy in white, two entities in From that are shrouded in mystery and seem to be central to the overall story, both of whom are the subject of feverish debate and discussion in the fandom. In this series of videos, I'll dissect everything we know about both of these characters and give you my theories on the nature of these shadowy figures and their purpose in the overall scheme of things, starting with the man in yellow, who I'll focus on in this video. So without further ado, let's get into it. The Man in Yellow is a brand new entity just introduced at the very end of Season 3, although he had already sent the fanbase into a frenzy of speculation after he appeared in one of Miranda's paintings in Season 3, Episode 2. And it appears that he may have been pulling the strings all along, we just didn't know it. And although the boy in white was first introduced to us way back in Season 1, Episode 2, he is still cloaked in mystery as well, as fans continue to debate whether he is a force for good, evil, or something more ambiguous in between. He also appears in one of Miranda's paintings, like the man in yellow does. And the boy in white's painting has been in the opening credits since the first episode of the series. And in one of the first scenes of the series premiere, the game of chess was introduced as a theme, which recurs multiple times later. And I believe that is a clue that it strongly implies a battle going on between two opposing forces who are using the characters for specific purposes. That doesn't mean it's purely for sport, though. The way I see it, one side is bringing characters to this place with the intent of helping the others trapped there and trying to break the cycle of violence. The other side is bringing people in specifically to use their individual traits to manipulate them into serving a harmful purpose, wanting to keep this cycle going and feeding on everyone's fear and suffering. After the conclusion of Season 3, I believe that our two opposing forces in this metaphorical chess game are the boy in white and the man in yellow. It's possible that they're both working under higher entities, but for now, these are the main figures that we have to work with. To be clear, I don't think that this is a typical battle between good versus evil, black and white. It's much more ambiguous and complex than that. While I think that the boy in white is helping, I don't see him as a purely good entity. I think he's trying to help end the cycle, but operates under a Machiavellian method of the ends justify the means. And the man in yellow will not be a cartoonish, two-dimensional villain. Rather, I predict he'll have a complex backstory that will eventually explain how he became corrupted and turned into this evil being over time. The man in yellow is actually credited as the man in the yellow suit. When we were first introduced to him, it was purely through one of Miranda's paintings in Season 3, Episode 2, and while there were many intriguing paintings in Henry's basement, that one in particular electrified the fandom as we wondered, who was this man with the sinister face, yellow suit, and red glowing aura? The red aura clearly seemed to be a hint that he's evil, apart from the obviously sinister eyes. Then at the end of the Season 3 finale, we finally got to see the man in yellow in the flesh. But what led to this moment? What led him to suddenly appear after all this time? Jim had just figured out that the numbers in the bottle trees translated to music notes. Jade played the song that came from those notes, and Jade and Tabitha experienced the revelation that they had been reincarnated many times over. Overwhelmed and confused, Jim went to the RV to be alone. A future version of Julie ran to him and begged him to come with her to town, saying, "I think this is where it happens." But Jim didn't listen to her and stayed. The man in yellow sauntered over, saying, "That was a hell of a song. That Jade sure can play." This implies that the song somehow summoned or released him. But really, it was the song sparking this revelation. That's what I think summoned the man in yellow. Because he went on to say, "This didn't have to happen, you know. I tried to warn you. Knowledge comes at a cost." So it was that revelation, that knowledge of Jade and Tabitha's origins, that was what summoned the man in yellow. And this is the cost of that newfound knowledge. The murder of Jim. The point of that is probably to cloud Tabitha's mind with so much grief and guilt that she'll be distracted from her quest to save the children and end the cycle. Also, essentially, it was Jim who sent Tabitha on the path that led to her revelation from the very beginning, long before he figured out the music notes. Recall that in season 1, Jim was the one who pointed out to Tabitha that there were no wires in the electrical cords, and by the end of that day she was already digging in the basement to see where the wires went, off on her quest to dive down the rabbit hole and eventually discover her origins. Tabitha digging the hole is what started her journey toward that revelation of her reincarnation. She saw the first Sankui child down in the cave, which ultimately led to her exit through the lighthouse, learning about what she later found out was her past life as Miranda, etc. Because once she saw that first child in the cave, more of them stalked her and she was determined to figure out what it all meant. Her instincts told her that this could be the key to getting home. So this explains why the man in yellow told Jim this didn't need to happen and his wife shouldn't have dug that hole. Then he killed him as payback. Because it all started with Jim pointing out those electrical wires. For more on Jim's fate and the time-traveling future Julie, check out my video Jim is Norman. Can Julie save him? Also, up to this point in the show, it's possible that the man in yellow didn't have a corporeal form and couldn't come into the physical world. So he had to use voices like the voice on the radio to play mind games, use the monsters to interact with and attack people, or manifest himself via the cicada entity. Why didn't he ever appear until now? Maybe he was summoned into the physical world by Tabitha and Jade's revelation. The man in yellow appeared with gray hair instead of brown, as the painting had depicted, and with his suit looking dirtier. Director Jack Bender painted it before casting Doug Hughes as the man in yellow, but the change in his appearance can also be explained in the same way that the boy in white's older look was explained to us. Everything has been changing here, along with the season turning to winter. The man in yellow is clearly evil, and it's heavily implied that he was the voice on the radio that talked to Jim in the season 1 finale cliffhanger. In a callback line to, "Your wife shouldn't be digging that hole, Jim," this time he said, "Your wife shouldn't have dug that hole, Jim." In several December 2024 interviews, Doug Hughes, who plays the man in yellow, gave his personal opinion that the character was the source of the voice on the radio. They used a different voice actor for the radio voice, but that doesn't mean it's not the same person. They hadn't cast Hughes in that role yet. I personally think it's safe to assume that his character was the source of that voice on the radio. So, the man in yellow could be omniscient, meaning he would have the ability to see and hear everything going on, as the voice on the radio knew Tabitha was digging the hole in the basement. But now that time travel has been introduced to the show, it's also possible that he's not really an omniscient being with a godlike ability to see and hear what everyone is doing. Rather, he could have come from the future, and therefore, he knew when Tabitha would be digging the hole. Or, perhaps, he could be an older version of a character from the present time who knew what was going to happen. And, again, he would have had to experience some kind of time travel and then come back. Though he seems human at first glance, his eyes appear demonic, and he was somehow able to rip open Jim's throat with his bare hands. No claws were visible, and in his interview with me in January 2025, Doug Hughes shared that he was not outfitted with any artificial claws. So it would seem that he might have actually ripped open Jim's throat by brute strength alone. We can't be completely sure of that, but I mean, if they wanted him to have claws, they definitely could have outfitted him with claws in that scene. He also demonstrated an unnatural level of strength as he was able to grab Jim by the neck and fling him against the RV, despite the fact that he's older than Jim with a much thinner frame. He might even have other abilities that we have yet to see. The man in yellow could have been the ringleader of the child sacrifice in the origin story, and perhaps he was turned into a different type of monster than the others, as he can come out in the daytime and we haven't seen him transform from a human appearance. Or he could have even been the entity that promised the people immortality in return for the child sacrifice. In an interview with What Is Fromcast, Doug Hughes offered his opinion that perhaps the man in yellow is upper management, since he can casually walk around in the daytime, unlike the nightmare creatures. Similarly, In an interview with Tony Teflon, when commenting on how his clothes are filthy while the monster's clothes are pristine, he joked about the man in yellow having a rougher time because maybe he's in management. To be clear, the actor doesn't definitively know anything about what's going on with the man in yellow. He's just offering his personal opinion that he seems to be a higher level entity because he can walk out in the daytime, which is logical, and I agree with that assessment. None of the actors are given information about the mysteries of this show. It's important to understand that, including the mystery behind the man in yellow. So all they can offer is their opinion, and they don't know any more than the rest of us. In season 2, Martin told Boyd that the monsters are only the tip of the spear, implying that some other entity is in control of them. And I think that the man in yellow is that entity. It's possible he might not be the big bad or the final boss, but I think it's safe to say he's indeed, at the very least, in some kind of management role, higher level entity over the monsters. And again, based on his knowledge of Tabitha digging in the basement, I think the man in yellow must either be an omniscient being or he engaged in some kind of time travel, and that's how he knew what was going to happen here. And he may be controlling the monsters, which would explain how the monsters, who have no pulse and behave like robots, were able to outsmart people and successfully stage 2 ambushes in season 3. For instance, they knew when the ambulance was coming, and Randall pointed out that they deviated from their usual routine that night. Most of them were hiding at first. Then one monster lay in the street pretending to be injured to lure the EMTs outside. Omniscience or time travel could also explain how the monsters knew Boyd said, "You don't break me," in the middle of the woods in the daytime, back in the season 2 finale. The man in yellow would be able to transmit that information to the monsters, possibly. Another key piece of information that Hughes gave in his interview with Tony and also in his interview with me in January 2025 is that he was asked to audition in person because while it was only a small role with one scene in season 3, if the show got a season 4, then the man in yellow would be more significant than just that one brief scene, which was only 45 seconds with him on screen. At least that's what he was told at the time. But there are no guarantees, of course, and the showrunner's plans could change. Still, I predict the man in yellow will play a pivotal role going forward with much more screen time. But what is the significance of his yellow suit? It's odd that it looks like it could be from the early 20th century, possibly, when there is evidence that Frumville dates back to the colonial Puritan period. These cabins here look very old, with dirt floors and a wagon wheel laying on the ground nearby. Also, in season 3, Jade had a vision of this Puritan man, and we found out that Miranda painted a vision of what appears to be a Puritan woman and more Puritan men. These are strong clues that Frumville dates back to at least the Puritan era, when I think the origin story occurred. So the man in yellow could have updated his wardrobe over time, along with the nightmare creatures who wear 50s and 60s outfits. But why is the suit yellow, though, which has a symbolically significant meaning throughout this series? I've discussed in other videos that the color yellow symbolizes hope in Western cultures. Boyd wears many yellow shirts, and he is the living embodiment of the town's hope. Ethan wears yellow in season 1 when he is at his most hopeful and innocent. And Fatima's favorite sweater was yellow as well, which is fitting because she was a beacon of hope and positivity until the Colony House massacre of season 1. That night, she gave her sweater away to Trudy, who immediately got murdered. It was as if Fatima's hope was symbolically murdered that night. She was never the same after the trauma of that massacre. So why then would this evil character wear yellow? Well, take a look at how dirty his yellow suit is. I think that could symbolize the tarnished, sullied hope of the people trapped here. As I said earlier, in Miranda's painting, the man in yellow looks younger, with dark hair and only half his suit looking dirty. The change in the state of his suit could symbolize the fact that he's become more and more corrupted over time, having committed an increasing number of evil acts, and this is the cumulative effect. Again, in his interview with Tony Teflon, Doug Hughes shared a fascinating and thought-provoking quote by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, author of Frankenstein, about how villains become what they are because they have been corrupted by their life circumstances. The quote reads, "The story of villains is much more entertaining than the story of heroes, because monsters are not born, they are made. They do not emerge from the void or darkness by themselves, but they are shaped by circumstances, by the wounds of the world around them. They reflect the deepest of human pain, rejection, loneliness, misunderstanding. A hero is defined by his acts of bravery, but a villain is the result of a heart that was once pure and ended up corrupted. The monsters, in their tragedy, show us what could happen to us all if the world turned its back on us." This quote could prove to be deeply relevant to the man in yellow. I recently did my own interview with Doug, again in January 2025, and he explained that since he wasn't given any information on the man in yellow and his background, he thought about how this character could have turned out the way that he is. And when he read Shelley's quote, it resonated with him, and he thought it could apply to the man in yellow in his opinion. Again, Hughes has no idea what the backstory of the man in yellow is, as the showrunners have remained tight-lipped about it, even to him, but he shared this quote because it's how he envisions what that backstory could look like. And I agree. I think Shelley's quote could shed light on how the man in yellow and also the people who turned into literal monsters, like Smiley here, wound up the way that they are. Yet they didn't turn out to be evil in the beginning. No one is born evil. We are all born innocent, but we become a product of our upbringing, the society in which we grow up, the people around us, our life circumstances, etc. In the nature versus nurture debate, nurture seems to be the most influential factor in shaping ourselves. So while the man in yellow could be a demonic figure of some sort, it's possible that he started out as an innocent being and became a monster over time. In Christianity, even Lucifer himself was a fallen angel, not born evil. And while the townspeople in the From origin story committed the most horrific act imaginable by sacrificing their children for immortality, they were all born as innocent people. Especially if you believe in tabula rasa, the philosophical concept that everyone is born with a clean slate, without any innate mental or emotional content. We don't know anything about the monster's backstory as humans yet, and nothing can justify their unthinkable actions. But it would be interesting to learn what kind of corrupting life circumstances drove them to commit the most heinous of deeds, as they murdered their children for their own selfish gain. In a December 2024 interview with Emmanuel Noisette, showrunner and writer John Griffin shared the story of his inspiration behind The Man in Yellow. He said that years ago, he was driving through LA and, quote, saw this man in a canary yellow suit, and he was just dancing and moving with such joy, but it wasn't like normal. It felt magical to the point where I couldn't take my eyes off him. And that guy almost felt like something unreal, unnatural. Flash forward to 4 or 5 years later, and I see this same man in the same yellow suit, only now it's tattered and it's worn, and his posture was weak and defeated, and all the joy had been washed out of him. It felt like I had somehow drifted onto the margins of something magical where, like we're in between, where I had seen him first and saw him again years later, like he had gone on this quest and he had somehow failed, he had lost, and I was seeing the aftermath of this magical figure that had been defeated. This story is extremely illuminating regarding the nature of the Man in Yellow. Keep in mind, John Griffin is the one who created this show, and this is him giving us a hint as to his inspiration. It strongly implies that Mary Shelley's quote about how monsters are created will indeed apply to the Man in Yellow, that he is, in Shelley's words, the result of a heart that was once pure and ended up corrupted. Because monsters are not born, they are made, as Shelley said. In other words, the Man in Yellow was not born evil. In my own interview with Doug Hughes, he again shared his personal opinion that the Man in Yellow was probably deeply damaged by something in his backstory that is yet to be revealed. And I love the wording that Griffin used in his story about the man on the street, that this man on the street looked like a magical figure, something unreal and unnatural in his joy, and then later he looked defeated and drained of all his joy, as if he had gone on a quest and was defeated. This wording strongly implies that there is indeed a magical, mystical situation going on in From, not pure science fiction. And the idea of a quest is a central theme of the show, a fixation of young Ethan. I'll get into more on Ethan and his potential connection to the man in yellow in a future video. But for now, suffice it to say, I think that the man in yellow probably did go on a quest and failed, his character becoming tainted and corrupted through that failure. This makes total sense because John Griffin is an incredible writer, and it wouldn't be his style to create a two-dimensional, cartoonish villain. In every villain's origin story, if it's well written, there's always a reason, or more accurately, multiple reasons and events that lead to them turning down a dark path until they eventually reach a point of no return. Perhaps even young Ethan here could turn out to be the man in yellow. Again, I'll get into that in a future video, but I'm seeing some potential foreshadowing in season 1 that this could be the case. Now, unlike the nightmare creatures, the man in yellow is able to be outside in the daytime, so he could pose a unique threat to the Fromvillians. Young Tabitha had a recurring nightmare in which she was out by the cabins and saw something that made her scream, but she couldn't remember what it was. That may have been the man in yellow. It's possible that he can't go into town and has to stay out in this area, or it's just where he happened to be in this dream and nearby when he accosted Jim. When trying to change the story, future Julie pleaded with Jim, saying, "You need to get back to town," as if this would keep him safe from the man in yellow. But the problem is that the residents still need to go back to the cabins to gather the rest of the crops there, and they'll be complacent enough to feel that they're safe in the daytime. So this could pose a problem in season 4. Some fans believe that some inspiration for the man in yellow could have come from the King in Yellow, the character from a collection of short stories by Robert Chambers. A similar character is also featured in H.P. Lovecraft's work, and he goes by the name Hoster, the King in Yellow, and the Unspeakable One. In Chambers' work, the King in Yellow is a powerful and mysterious non-human being, bringer of madness and doom. The stories also refer to a place called Carcosa, a mysterious, ancient, and possibly cursed city. So some fans have drawn parallels between Carcosa and Fromville. On a recent live stream, I had the guest panelist Infinite Umbra join me, and he did some great detective work on the spot, finding some strong parallels to The Man in Yellow and From in the 1975 children's book Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. There is a mysterious, evil character simply called the Man in the Yellow Suit, who seeks immortality and lives in a village called Tree Gap near a forest, which he wants to commercialize. He tries to find a legendary spring with water that brings immortality and says he'll sell it to people who deserve it, and it will be very expensive. This could be interpreted to mean that he could trick people into drinking it and it will cost them dearly, not just in terms of money, because ultimately it's a curse, not a blessing. The Tuck family in the book who drank from the stream regretted it and didn't want immortality anymore. In From, perhaps the man in yellow tricked the original townspeople into bargaining for immortality, and indeed, the cost was very expensive, much more than money, their children's lives. It turned out there was even more to the cost as well, since it turned them into these nightmare creatures. And they certainly deserved their fate, the immortality that turned out to be a curse, not a blessing. Also, in Tuck Everlasting, the man in the yellow suit is able to find the Tuck family when he recognizes the tune from a music box that he had learned from his grandmother. A music box featured prominently in From Season 2, and Bacta recognized the cicada nursery rhyme connected to that music box because her grandmother had taught it to her. So these are more parallels to From. Umbra also theorized that the Lake of Tears could be a reference to the spring water that bestowed immortality in Tuck Everlasting. Perhaps the Lake of Tears could have even been what transformed the original townsfolk into nightmare creatures. If that's the case, Lake of Tears is certainly a fitting name. I predict it will be found somewhere out in the forest, much like the spring water in Tuck Everlasting was deep in the forest. It would make sense if From has used children's literature as inspiration. There are also real children's books called The Magic Faraway Tree by Enid Blyton and The Lake of Tears by Jennifer Rao. Also, the fictitious children's book The Flight of the Crominocle is prominently featured in the show through Ethan and his family. And Kotri notes that while there are no Bibles in town, there are books by Judy Blume, popular children's author. Furthermore, there is a book of children's Bible stories, too, despite the total lack of Bibles in town. So again, children's literature seems to be an influence on the show, and maybe the writers took some inspiration from the man in the yellow suit from Chuck Everlasting. In the credits, the character is literally also simply named the man in the yellow suit. Most likely, there are multiple sources of inspiration for this character. You can't just draw a line between one to the other. It's not going to be that simple, and they're definitely not going to copy a character from another work. But again, they could employ a sort of fusion of multiple influences in the creation of this character. From the first scene with the Matthews family, children's stories have been prominently featured as Julie acted out a story for Ethan with his finger puppets. Ethan frequently compares events in the show to his Crominocle story and gives insight onto how things work based on these stories. So, given all of these ubiquitous references to children's literature, both real and invented for the show, I don't think it would be a stretch of the imagination to surmise that the man in the yellow suit could be at least partly inspired by the character of the same name in Tuck Everlasting. The show wouldn't outright plagiarize a character from another work, but looking at this potential source of inspiration could give us insight into the nature of Frum's Man in Yellow. He is likely to be a huckster, a con artist, which would make sense given the fact that Frumville is full of illusions, like the word on Julie's shirt in Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. Julie's shirt was definitely a clue planted at the start of his series. People are often manipulated by various kinds of illusions in Frumville, like visions and voices, things that aren't really there. Some of these illusions might be originating from the man in yellow. For instance, Boyd was tricked into bringing the words back to town, manipulated by the ballerina visions that hinted at how he should give the bloodworms to a monster and ultimately unleash the cicada entity that threatened the entire town. But more on that later. Then there are the ghost entities. I think that Ghost Kotri might be an entity that's there to manipulate Boyd, and Ghost Tom might be an entity to manipulate Jade. Ghost Abby was most definitely an entity bent on manipulating Boyd into giving up, trying to convince him to stay in the RV with her as the monsters were approaching, and then trying to talk him out of smashing the music box. The monsters themselves are illusions. They look like smiling, pleasant people who say whatever they can to trick people into letting their guard down until they transform into creatures and rip them apart. All the buildings are illusions, too. The school is really a clinic, the gas station is a bar, and the post office is the sheriff's station. Very little is as it seems here, and I think all of that is part of the Man in Yellow's playbook. It's all about illusions. In order to see through the illusions of this place and find a way out, it's essential for Tabitha and Jade to open their third eye, which is also displayed on the goat from Julie's shirt. They need to become enlightened, which in their case means remembering their origins, their past lives, and their mission, which they have just begun to do, so now they have a fighting chance to complete that mission and save the children, if they can figure out what saving the children even means at this point. But the man in yellow will continue to pose a threat and throw obstacles in their way, such as the trauma and the grief of Jim's death that will be a huge source of distraction for Tabitha. And his presence could completely upend life in Frumville, changing the rules of the game so that people are no longer safe in the daytime. Now, from the start, it has seemed as if an evil force has been selecting certain people to exploit their weaknesses and cause harm, bringing them to town like chess pieces, and I think the man in yellow is that force. Sarah told Elgin in the season 3 finale that maybe they are the kind of people that this place wants, people who just want to help. The man in yellow could be bringing people who want to help, but who have traits or weaknesses that can be exploited, so they can be tricked into causing harm. Sarah seems traumatized and maybe even mentally ill in addition to that. When she was asked by Christy in season 1 about her ex, She shut down and just said, "It's better he's not here." She said that her brother Nathan saved her, and he was bringing her to Boston to live with him when they wound up in Frumville. The way she shut down and said so little about her ex seemed like a trauma response, and since her brother saved her and was taking her to live with him, it's possible that her ex was abusive. This is pure conjecture, but she may have even killed her ex in self-defense. She murdered Toby so skillfully that it seemed like it wasn't her first kill. Either way, the timing of her winding up here can't be a coincidence, in my opinion. It would make sense for the man in yellow to bring her there to exploit her trauma. Her trauma would make her an easy target for the voices to convince her to murder Toby, leave the clinic door open at night, and try to murder Ethan. Not many people would be susceptible to voices in their head telling them to commit murder, but a traumatized young woman who possibly just murdered an abusive boyfriend would be a prime candidate. Another prime target would be Elgin. He is a genuinely kind person who wants to help, like Sarah. And the trait that the man in yellow could exploit is his strong religious faith. After he started seeing the kimono lady, he told Julie that his grandma taught him that angels may look scary, but he should fear not. He later told Boyd that he believed the kimono lady is an angel, pointing out that people in the Bible had to do things even when they didn't understand why at the time. It definitely seemed like Elgin was chosen to be there. He is one of a few characters who has had a seizure, which happened when he arrived, and he had a premonition dream with the boy in white in it on the way into town. As I said before, the boy in white may have been trying to send Elgin a warning in that dream. If he was chosen to be there, I would say it had to be by the man in yellow due to his religious faith, to manipulate him into believing the kimono lady and kidnapping Fatima to birth a nightmare creature. I think that was the plan all along. The bus was brought to town at the same time when Boyd was on his trek in the woods that led to him getting the worms. The big bad seems to be omniscient. It heard him yelling, "You don't break me," in the middle of the woods in season 2, as the monsters later referenced that line. So, the man in yellow could know that Boyd was planning that trip to the woods, especially as he spoke about it at Abby's grave, with Cautry, and at the diner. So, again, this knowledge could either come from omniscience or, as I said earlier, time travel. I think the big bad, or the man in yellow, brought Elgin to town in preparation for Boyd's infection with the worms, the passing of the worms to Smiley, and then the resurrection of Smiley. It was all an orchestrated mind game. Again, Boyd was even given hints on how to kill Smiley with the worms by the ballerina visions. I think the man in yellow wanted Boyd to get the worms, bring them to town, and consequently unleash the cicada entity which threatened everyone's lives. The cicada entity, or probably even the man in yellow himself, spoke to Sarah in her head at the end of season 2 and said, "It's laughing at you for bringing it to town." So all along, it's clear to me that the plan was always to orchestrate events so that Boyd would get the worms, use them to kill a monster, Elgin would be there to help the kimono lady set up its rebirth, and the cicada entity, unleashed by Smiley's dead body, would capture 3 people's spirits and threaten the lives of everyone in town. It could have even led to everyone's deaths. If Boyd hadn't smashed the music box, I would venture to say that the whole town would have died, ripped apart in their sleep, eventually, except for Fatima, who would have been left alive long enough to resurrect Smiley. But Elgin was a backup plan. If Boyd defeated the cicada entity, then Elgin would be there to assist the kimono lady with Fatima's kidnapping. So long story short, there is strong evidence to support the theory that Elgin was brought to town by the man in yellow and or the big bad to be manipulated. Another character who was probably brought to town for purposes of manipulation is Tilly, another person who just wanted to help, but was seemingly used as a pawn. She was already dying of cancer, so she wasn't afraid to be around Fatima, even though she saw Fatima eating rotten vegetables and becoming increasingly dark while pregnant. Tilly followed her around constantly and tried to reassure her, a naturally nosy person with a strong urge to try to help and reassure people without a fear of dying. This makes her an ideal pawn for this purpose. The way I see it, the big bad, or the man in yellow, needed a victim to be in Fatima's orbit, getting too close to her all the time, no matter how scary Fatima became. Then the creature inside her would inevitably drive her to murder, as it was hungry for blood and Fatima was resisting that craving. And once Fatima committed murder, she was isolated and an easy target for Elgin to trick into coming with him to the root cellar. Also, Tilly kept trying to reassure Fatima that how she was feeling was normal, which might have kept her from feeling the need to tell others what was going on, another way of keeping her isolated. I don't think this was malicious, though. Tilly was just trying to help, and the big bad used her as an unwitting tool. Of course, we can't be sure if the man in yellow is the big bad yet. He could just be working for the big bad, but I'm inclined to think that he is the main evil force in the show, while the boy in white is the force for good, or at least the force that's trying to help as best it can and end the cycle. We just don't have enough evidence yet to make a strong case for who or what the man in yellow is and what he has done, but this is what I've been able to piece together so far. He is still a brand new addition to the show, although he's apparently been working behind the scenes all along, as his line to Jim that his wife shouldn't have dug that hole suggests that he was the source of the voice on the radio talking to Jim in season 1. But when it comes to the boy in white, there is a great deal more concrete information to analyze, because he's actually been present in scenes on camera from the beginning, and I'll dive into the boy in white's role in part 2 of this theory series. Again, I believe the boy in white and the man in yellow are two opposing entities that are bringing residents to town to use them like chess pieces against each other. The man in yellow is bringing people to town to manipulate them in an effort to keep the cycle of death and terrorism going, while the boy in white is bringing people to town to try to help break the cycle. I'll deep dive into the boy in white's role in part 2 of this theory, examining what I believe to be the other entity engaging in this supernatural game of chess. Then, in a third video in this series, I'll take another look at the man in yellow and his potential identity. Now, I want to know what you think. What kind of threat do you think the man in yellow will pose in season 4? What kind of entity do you think he is, and how much power does he hold? Do you think this could operate like a game of chess, with two opposing forces using the residents like chess pieces? Or could there be more than two forces? Let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and until next time, keep on deep diving, and let's see what we can uncover together.